maybe some ill-timed melt and some heavier rain or something in the spring might be approaching 2009. So we hope that's not going to be something that's insurmountable for most communities. But he'll give a briefing on that. So we provide forecasts and information on current conditions on lakes and waterways, and I think you'll see on the website and through the Water Management Structures Division and the HFC that those folks provide that general information for you. I think I already discussed this, but MI operates regional water control and flood mitigation infrastructure. So Shellmouth Dam, Red River Floodway, Portage Diversion, Fairford River Water Control Structure, et cetera, et cetera. There's quite a lot of those out in Manitoba. In fact, it's one of the things in Manitoba that is helpful for us is that we do have a good flood mitigation network. It certainly isn't perfect, and I would expect that some of the folks in this room would want to point out some shortfalls to us, and hopefully I'll be able to gather some of that information today. I will say, then you asked a question for us to speak to is what's working and what needs to be improved when it comes to collaborative water management. So from a flood preparedness, that kind of flood water management perspective, I think what we think is working well is that since 2011, infrastructure has employed a special liaison officer to work with First Nations communities to ensure that all the information that's been being pushed out by the HFC gets to those that need it in a timely manner, to ensure they're connected so they can do their own risk assessments and do their work, and answering questions and whatnot. Now, this fellow, Lyle Campbell, is retiring this year, but I can tell you that Manitoba Infrastructure is committed to ensuring that that function continues and that we keep that communication going. So that works well, that piece of direct communication that came out of the 2011 Flood Task Force report. I think generally my perspective from emergency management is cooperation with the First Nations that EMO has had to work with, and our partners over in water management are the ones that they've had to work with on specific flood stuff during these floods. That cooperation at a tactical level with EMO and MI staff that work with local communities has always been really excellent, we find. There's always issues at higher levels, but definitely at the tactical level, it's good cooperation and good work. I will say as well that one thing that's beginning to really take hold is the increased capacity of communities across Manitoba, be they First Nation communities or municipalities, in dealing with risk assessment and tackling some of these issues. It's getting better all the time, and I would say that recently met with the chief and the chiefs from the IRTC about some of their initiatives for some flood response and emergency operations centers and dispatch centers for equipment and building capacity, and it's pretty interesting. And those guys have done a detailed hazard identification and risk assessment that's informing that process. So that's a really excellent initiative. Areas for improvement. First of all, Cam Blight that was here from AMM. I think I would echo that some of the things that he mentioned are probably things that we all recognize that could be improved. So areas for improvement, planning and flood risk avoidance. So we think that it's where you're putting infrastructure, houses, developments across Manitoba is always important to understand where the flood risks are. And we see in across Manitoba in many municipalities where they're wanting to put down subdivisions and whatnot, and they're putting them in places that are increasing their future flood risks. So those are things that we think can be better writ large across the province. And that also goes to in First Nation communities with getting flood risk mapping and so people can make those important decisions on where things go and how to manage it. I do understand that there's some constraints with land, and I think someone that spoke earlier about how do you move houses when you don't have a lot of land to move them to, and I can't speak to those issues, but I know that Indigenous Services Canada and the chiefs are probably dealing with those types of issues on a regular basis. I know there's sometimes gaps and uncertainties about responsibility for flood preparedness and response and also recovery. I think that so there's a gap there that between province, communities, and in this case, Indigenous Services Canada, we continue to work on improving that discussion to make sure we do it. So that's that. I think Mr. Blight earlier made a comment about, I don't know, he said communications is critical. So for me, from an emergency management perspective, I got the 3 C's that I think are super important, and I think they're what always guide me. One of them is communications. Other one is collaboration, like working together to solve these problems. And the third one is compromise, because I know that sometimes when emergencies are on, I want to get my way, but I don't always get my way, and I have to stand back and understand the perspective of others and what they need to get done for what their responsibilities are. And I also say this is that while in emergency management or emergency measures and in water management structures, we have our roles and responsibilities at sort of some provincial level tying things in. We do understand that the responsibilities at the community level, and including with and especially with First Nation communities, with chiefs and council, is actually a significant responsibility looking after actual people, and that's where real work is done. So I normally, during emergencies, sit on the 15th floor of a building downtown in Winnipeg, so the chance of me being impacted by flooding is 0, whereas the real people on the ground, like you folks, are dealing with these flood response issues here and now and the pressures that they are. And I actually really appreciate that kind of pressure and that responsibility you have. So what I'll do is I'll open up for questions. Wait, sorry. You don't want me to? Oh, sorry. There will be no questions to me until later. Yeah, I will. Yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you, Mike, for your presentation, and we will open the floor up for questions. If anyone has any questions for Mike after we hear from the next 2 presenters, we'll have them up here as a panel, and then we will open up the floor for any questions that you guys may have. So at this time, I would like to call up Glenn Howell, and he's going to be presenting on water management on behalf, he is the Director of Community Supports on behalf of Pam Smith, who is the Regional Director for First Nations and Inuit Health Branch Manitoba. So please welcome Glenn Howell.
Thank you, Jenna. Hopefully when I put my papers on this computer, I won't do anything too strange. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel today. My name is Glenn Howell, as Jenna mentioned, and I am the Regional Director of Community Supports at First Nations and Inuit Health Branch of Indigenous Services Canada. It's getting to be a very long name that we have at FNIB now with all these acronyms. FNIB Regional Director or Regional Executive Officer Pam Smith sends her regrets and has asked that I participate on her behalf. FNIB programs and services work with communities in a number of ways related to flood preparation. So in answer to the question of what is our role is very much a planning role with working with the communities. And I'll just talk about a few of those ways that we're part of the planning process, and then get into some of the ways that we can collaborate further. So through our management and support program, resources are provided to communities to develop multi-year work plans and community health plans. Community health plans and multi-year work plans also have linkages to the all hazards plans developed by communities, and there is resources there to support tabletop exercises and simulations and those kinds of things. Most of our programming that we provide communities on a regular basis can also be used to support tabletop exercises, scenarios, different things like that. One of our major areas involved in planning for communities is the Environmental Public Health Program. So we have environmental public health officers that work with us at FNIB, and there are a number of them that work directly for communities with tribal councils. And they provide advice, guidance, recommendations. They can also provide education sessions on environmental public health risks and planning. Community health nurses or primary care nurses, depending on whether you have a health center or a nursing station in your community, are also a big part of the planning process. One of the most important things that the nurses will be involved in is developing the priority lists at the local level. So that's your priority 1, 2, and 3 community members that need to be moved out of the community first or need special arrangements when they are moved out of the community, such as if you have mobility issues or specific medical care that you require. They are linked to the regional office through the health center nurse manager or the nurse manager for the respective nursing station. They also have a 24/7 on-call system through the nurse manager on call. So your nurse or the nurse in the nursing station can contact them 24/7 if there are issues. They also have access to the Medical Officer of Health Network, which we have one of the medical health officers that we provide funding for, but the province, each RHA also has positions as well, and they kind of rotate who's on call, so there's always a medical officer of health available. And then they can work with other staff in the regional office and call up other people and activate them as needed when emergencies arise. We also have communicable disease nurse specialists who work with communities on a regular basis to develop immunization plans and public health management plans, public health emergency management plans. One of the best preparations for any emergency is ensuring that immunizations and public health, communicable diseases are properly managed and documented in the community, because that information becomes very important once people start moving around and getting moved around to other places. The nurses in communicable disease support can also assist in the priority list development process. Let's see. One of the areas that doesn't have normally a stated direct link, but is very important, is the home care nurses. And now with the advent of Jordan's Principle, the Jordan's Principle caseworkers, managers as well. The amount of information that home care has on adult clients or adult community members, and the Jordan's Principle has on the children in the community now, is an incredible resource and can become a big part of planning any evacuation required or any emergency management plan that needs to be undertaken. One of the new areas of development as well that's a big part of the planning process is we've started to see the implementation of electronic medical records systems in a variety of ways. So some of the southern communities have made their own linkage to the RHA and started using the RHA's EMR system in the community, which has been great. And it helps a lot because there's no federal staff involved in those situations where it's the band and the RHA working together, so you don't have to deal with federal privacy laws, which can be a burdensome thing. But we are working through all of that, and we now have one community in the north using an electronic medical record system, and the next one is going to be coming online in the next few months. Once we get through all the implementation challenges of the first couple of communities, we expect this to roll out to all the other nursing station communities over the next 2 or 3 years. So it should, once it gets going, it'll hit a good pace, and we can just repeat. And then we also have the 2 hospitals in Manitoba, Percy E. Moore in Peguis and Norway House Hospital in Norway House, where it's a little bit of a different thing than the EMR. It's an electronic patient record system. It has different challenges, so we're still in the planning stage of that, but we are working towards implementation of electronic patient record systems there. So what those will do, those various systems will give you immediate access to any medical information in the community or when you get moved to any other site if that becomes required. One last system that's in place related to that is called a community EMR system. These tend to be not as integrated into the provincial web of systems, but it can still be an asset because if the community is using an EMR system and then they're backing their data up off reserve, then they can access it when they have to leave the community. So in terms of further collaboration that we could do, one of the interesting things over this last year or so is that what was formerly Health Canada, FINIB, and was formerly INAC, have now merged together into Indigenous Services Canada. And our teams are already working pretty close together. We're only a few blocks away from each other, so most know each other quite well, and we had good contact with emergency management, but now we're all part of the same department with the same objectives, and I think that'll really help a lot and build on the improvements that we've seen in these last few years of emergency management response by INEC, FNIB side in these last few years. I've been with one department and then the other for a number of years now. I can say that definitely these last few years have been a huge improvement compared to what it was many years ago, and I think all the tools are in place to keep building on it. So I think that's probably about where I'll stop there for now, and then I'll be up here as well for if there's any questions after. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Maybe come on this side. The projector's cutting you off there. So a reminder that we will have time to ask both Mike and Glenn questions if you guys have any. So our last presenter in this panel is David Cormie. He is the Director of the Wholesale Power and Operations, and he's here on behalf of Manitoba Hydro. So please welcome David Cormie.
Good afternoon. Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm Director of Wholesale Power and Operations at Manitoba Hydro. I've been involved in water management at Manitoba Hydro since 1976. I've been involved in managing many floods since that time, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity of sharing with you this afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to recognize that we're on Treaty 1 territory, and along with the homeland of the Métis Nation. This morning, I was pleased to hear Elder Mary May-Washing for her opening prayer and water ceremony. It was very interesting, and I enjoyed that a lot. I'd like to thank Grand Chief Dumas for inviting Manitoba Hydro to attend this forum this year. I know there was a call last year that Manitoba Hydro wasn't present, and we're glad to be able to attend this year. We have a new president. Our new president is Jay Gruwal. She was invited but is unable to attend, so I have the privilege of attending and sharing with you my experience in water management. Normally, Manitoba Hydro is focused on managing the water flows in the major rivers in the province for the purposes of producing hydroelectricity. But that focus shifts during flood events when moving the flood waters through the system safely becomes our priority. And getting it from source down into Hudson Bay without minimizing the impact on affected communities in the hydro-affected communities. Now, our focus is not on the generating stations themselves. Those generating stations are capable of passing the largest conceivable floods, and so that's not the focus of our concern. The focus of our concern is on affected communities, those communities that have been affected by the hydro projects, and we want to ensure that a flood that occurs does not become an emergency in those communities. We know floods occur. They've occurred historically. You can go back in the records hundreds of years, and the records show that significant floods have occurred. Manitoba Hydro knows that, and we plan for those events. And in planning for those events, we avoid the floods being an emergency. We make sure that for affected communities that the infrastructure that's there is capable of handling the floods without causing an emergency. So that means infrastructure is built for the high water levels. Water intakes are designed so that the pumping plants don't fail when water levels get high. That riprap along the shorelines is adequate so that shoreline erosion is managed. that roads are maintained so that access to the affected communities is maintained during these flood events. Floods in affected Manitoba Hydro communities should not be emergency. We have a responsibility to those communities to do that. And we're committed to working with affected communities so that if there are impacts, that those impacts are dealt with so that the next time they come around, we're not repeating the same problems. Manitoba Hydro monitors a huge watershed going all the way to the Rocky Mountains in between Alberta and British Columbia. The Saskatchewan River flows across the prairies. Water rises in northwest Ontario near Thunder Bay, and it flows west into Lake Winnipeg down the Winnipeg River. It rises in the most northeasterly corner of South Dakota and flows down the Red River into Lake Winnipeg, and it's also flowing across Western Canada in the Churchill River. And those flows all come towards Manitoba because Manitoba is the low point. And water drains to the low point, it drains into Lake Winnipeg, and then it flows to the sea through the hydro plants on the Nelson River. So we're actively monitoring every day of the year what those water flows are, and we're well prepared during flood events to respond to those because that's just our business. Our business is water management every day, year in and year out, so that there's an adequate supply of electricity. But for people here in Winnipeg and in southern Manitoba, they generally don't see the flood events that occur in Alberta, where those floodwaters actually flow into Manitoba. We're all familiar with the flood of the century in 1997 because southern Manitoba was inundated by water. Many communities were underwater, and this is where most of the people are. But in the northern communities, you can have flood events in Calgary, like happened in 2014. The Saskatchewan River goes into flood. Those floodwaters work their way through the system, and they work their way through Lake Winnipeg, and then they affect communities that are on the Nelson River downstream. And it's a surprise to them because it's not in the media. It's not something local. It's not something that's happening in their backyard. It's happening thousands of miles away. But the river systems bring that water into Manitoba, and Manitoba Hydro has to help those communities deal with those floods that arise many, many miles away. This is a chart that shows the flow of the waters as it flows through Manitoba down to the sea. And surprisingly, most of the water that flows in our rivers rises outside of Manitoba. Over 70% of the water that we see in our rivers comes from Alberta and Saskatchewan and Northwest Ontario and South Dakota and North Dakota. It's not water that's local to us. And so most of the floodwaters that we experience are floods that are created outside of Manitoba, and they work their way into the province, and Manitoba Hydro has to deal with those. And you can see as the waters collect into Lake Winnipeg, the amount of water that flows down the Nelson River is huge compared to the flows in any particular river. Of the flow on the Nelson River, 30% of that flow comes from the Winnipeg River, about 20% comes from Saskatchewan. Only the Red River, which is the one that's most visible from a flooding perspective, really only comprises about 7% of the flow on the Nelson River. So you can have a flood on the Red River that doesn't create a flood on the Nelson River. Floods on the Nelson River, where most of our projects are created by flood events on the Winnipeg River and on the Saskatchewan River and on the Churchill River. We're responsible for communities who are affected by these hydro projects throughout the province. And then these projects are on the Winnipeg River, the Saskatchewan River, the Burntwood River, the Churchill River, and the Nelson River. The vast majority of our generating stations are in the north, but all of our hydro projects affect local communities and resource users. And we're very cognizant of that, and we work with those communities to minimize those effects, to avoid the impacts if possible. But if there are impacts, then we're working with the communities to make sure that those impacts are, that they know about them, that there's a flood coming, and they're prepared to deal with them. Once the water is working its way down the river systems, it's too late to deal with them. You can have an emergency. So what we do is we work with the communities well in advance so that the infrastructure is properly prepared so that if a flood occurs, it doesn't cause an impact. That means working with affected communities so that there are proper setback lines, so that houses are built above the high water mark, so that the shorelines are armored so that erosion doesn't occur when high water conditions occur, so that water intakes are adequately placed so that floods don't cause them to stop working, so that roads are not flooded when high water conditions occur. And all the infrastructure that the loss of that would create an emergency, that's all planned for, and that those impacts are thought through. And so when the high water conditions occur, we don't have an emergency. Some of the works are protecting shorelines in the communities so that erosion doesn't occur and under high water conditions. In some communities and some lakes, we have to dig additional channels so that when floodwaters do occur, they're passed through the community at lower levels than they would without the channels. The other thing that we do is we're in constant communication with affected communities on what the water level conditions are. And that's not just during flood events, but that's every month, year in and year out, making information available to communities so that they know what to expect with regard to water levels. Those forecasts are provided to the chief and council. They're provided over the radio. They're broadcast. We have a website where the information is available for users who are interested in knowing. However, during flood events, when there's heightened concern, there's a lot of media coverage, and communities become aware that a flood may be coming, then we have more frequent communications. And we have meetings with the water regime committees with those communities, and if necessary, we'll have meetings with the chief and council to make sure that they're aware of how hydro operations are going to affect their communities. Most important in all our operations is that public safety is first priority. And although we have operating limits in our Water Power Act licenses that require us to operate our facilities in a certain manner, public safety overrides all those considerations. And so before water levels are changed, we have to make sure that those people who, and resource users who are affected by those changes, are aware that water level changes are coming. And that could involve getting in a helicopter, flying a river, looking for those resource users who may not be aware of what's in the news, may not be aware that water level changes are coming, so that when we do make flow changes at the control structures, that it's safe to do so. During flood events, we make sure that we're coordinated with the Minister of Sustainable Development so that our operations are consistent with what's required in an emergency. Our operations always consider the impact on waterway and resource users, and we issue the water level forecasts so that they're aware of changes. It's critical during ice formation periods when the ice is used as skidoos and resource users are out in the backcountry. When there's community events, we don't want water level changes to disrupt a community event. And so on a daily basis, we're in contact with those communities, aware of what's happening so that our operations are considerate of those things. However, in an Emergency Measures Organization in Manitoba does have control. Ultimately, this becomes an issue between EMO and the band, and Manitoba Hydro responds as part of that team. Post-floods, we go back in those projects and make sure that cleanup is done, docks are repaired, docks are replaced, debris that has come onto the shorelands caused by the flood is removed and burnt if necessary. We resume our safe boat patrols to make sure that the waterways are safe for resource users, and shoreline maintenance is done to repair any damage that caused by the flood. For the upcoming year, we're looking across Western Canada, and we see pretty normal snowpack across Western Canada. Later this afternoon, we'll hear from the flood forecaster what the outlook for flooding is. But Manitoba Hydro expects on the main river flows, the Winnipeg River, the Nelson River, the Saskatchewan River, that river flows will be in the normal range, and no floods are anticipated this time. But like everybody says, it's still only February. There's lots of chance for things to change. You could have more snow, could be a very late melt, could be heavy spring rains, or a combination of all three that would take what looks like a normal spring and turns it into a very high water year. We just don't know that yet. So what are we doing to improve our operations? Well, as part of the climate change work that Manitoba Hydro is doing, we're investigating the use of the climate models to help predict what the weather is going to be out for up to 14 days into the future, so that these large rainstorms that generally trigger flood events. We can see them coming 14 days in advance, and we can start issuing warnings in advance rather than reacting after it's rained, but you can react before it rains. And so with the use of modern technology and the research that we're doing into climate change, we can provide communities that are affected by our operations with more advanced warning. The other thing that we're trying to do is make our information more available to affected communities. We have lots of information out there already, but now we need to make it available to people on their telephones so that they have apps that they can use an app and find out what's the water level changes expected for their communities. So that's some of the work that's going on. So yes, that's my presentation.
All right, thank you, David Cormy, for your presentation. So at this time, we're going to open up a brief question period. So I have Lisa here on the floor. Just raise your hand if you have any questions. Again, we have Mike up here from the province of Manitoba, as well as Glenn in the middle from FNIB, and then, of course, David Cormy from Manitoba Hydro. If you want to direct your question to either one of them, maybe acknowledge that first, and then we'll have you guys answer. So we have a question here.
Yes, hello. My name is Cornell Fontaine from Saugeen First Nation. I'm just here just to ask a question to the hydro person. I was wondering why, since Saugeen is the only reserve on the Winnipeg River, how come we don't have a representative? I know Hydro has a representative that controls the flow of the Winnipeg River, which comes from Ontario. And Ontario Hydro and the government of Canada and Manitoba Hydro there's a board, and there's no native representation. Why isn't there a person from Saugeen sitting there on that board with Manitoba Hydro?
Is my mic on? Yes. That's a good question. Just a bit of background, the flows in the Winnipeg River in Ontario are controlled by a board called the Lake of the Woods Control Board, and it has representation from the governments of Ontario, Canada, and Manitoba on it. That representation is what's in the legislation, and there's no reason why an Indigenous person couldn't be on the board. They would have to meet the qualifications that are laid out in the representation, and the governments of Canada, Ontario, or Manitoba would have to appoint that person. The board receives representations from many interest groups on how the water flows should be regulated. Manitoba Hydro is included in that, and how the flows on Lake of the Woods and Lac Seul are regulated. But the representatives don't have control of the flows. That's a decision that the board makes. I'm sure that any party could approach the board and ask to be heard at the board meetings that make those decisions. I know the board is very open to having representations, and all I could suggest is that if you have an interest, if Saugeen wants to have participate in that process, that the board would welcome their representation.
Thank you, David Cormy. Any other questions?
Good afternoon. George Kemp, Barons River First Nation. I'm here with Councillor Roland Whiteway. We're on the east side of Lake Winnipeg, the 12th largest lake in the world that's being destroyed by hydro, by the city of Winnipeg, because they won't build a sewage plant on the north end of the city here. I'd like to ask Mike, when is the province of Manitoba going to put together a comprehensive water management strategy, because Lake Winnipeg is dumped on from all angles. And we're the ones on Lake Winnipeg that suffer from all the drainage, from all the pollution that's coming, and all these new channels and so forth that they want to build. Everything is dumped on our communities. And since Hydro started regulating Manitoba water levels, which they shouldn't be involved in regulating Lake Winnipeg because they're in a conflict of interest. They want to keep water in Lake Winnipeg. They keep it high on purpose because it's money to them, but it's destruction to us. Our shorelines, our fisheries, everything is wasting away. I stood on the shore in 1972 when Hydro came to Barons River to talk about putting in the Genpeg Dam. They told my dad and Stanley Ross, the chief at that time, Lake Winnipeg would barely go up 6 inches. You won't even notice it. And I'm glad there's a guy from Hydro here from 1976. But since then, I got pictures. This summer was the first time since the 1960s that Lake Winnipeg went back down to the normal level that that lake was since time immemorial, when things didn't erode and wash away. We used to have 7 beaches in Barons. Today we got none. That's all Hydro. But I have a picture, and I can show you. The black line shows that Lake Winnipeg has been raised 4 feet, not 6 inches. So we have so much water in Lake Winnipeg that all the shorelines around the lake are being wasted away. When I hear about drainage and when I hear about water management, that's not water management. You're moving the problem from the inner lake, from southern Manitoba, into our lake. And under Treaty 5, we never signed away Lake Winnipeg. That's our lake. So when you talk about a comprehensive strategy, will your comprehensive strategy address those issues, address Lake Winnipeg? Because we're not a dumping ground. Where is our rights in this as communities on Lake Winnipeg? We have a $60 million fishing industry, commercial fishing industry that's going down the drain because Winnipeg won't build a sewage plant on the north end of this city. We need to be involved. The communities on Lake Winnipeg need to be involved. The communities up north. I'm sitting here with people from South Indian Lake. They talk about the same thing. South Indian Lake is silting in. I was talking to Sam Murdoch. He's here. He was talking about that new outlet channel going into Lake Winnipeg. The outlet channel, they're putting the outlet into spawning grounds on Lake Winnipeg. Spawning grounds for our fishery. Sam has complained about that. Nobody's listening to him. He's fished all his life on that lake. Our people have lived all our lives on that lake. In Barons River, we have houses falling into the river because over 40 years of high water, the banks of the river have become soft and slips into the river. We can't get no help there. We asked Indian Affairs in the 2011 flood to come and help us. Nothing happened. There's a guy here, Vern says he's got a fund for that. We got nothing out of there. We get nothing out of Hydro. Where do we fit in this whole plan and strategy that you have here in Manitoba? I don't see it, but I hear lots of talk about strategy and management, all those kind of things. So I fail to see, yeah, it's a strategy and management to save you people in the south, but you forget about us around Lake Winnipeg. Our communities are being destroyed. There's places there where there's islands now that stood for hundreds of years. They were points. Now they're islands. If you talk to Hydro about that, they say, oh no, that's just natural progression. That's just natural. Well, they're full of BS. We've lived there. We've seen these changes. We've seen the beaches destroyed. All that kind of stuff. We've seen our fishery go down. When a disaster happens down south here, you get flood mitigation. Not only that, your farmers get disaster relief. What do our fishermen on Lake Winnipeg get? Nothing. We have to shoulder the brunt of all of this waste management and water management in our lake. It's the most polluted lake in the world. So I want you people to wake up and think about these kind of things in your strategy. So I'm going to ask you, what kind of a strategy do you guys have, Hydro and Manitoba, in terms of what management? Comprehensive management, not piecemeal management. That's what you got right now. And I'll let you answer.
Mike?
Thank you.
Should just be kept on.
Can you hear me? Oh, there we go. So at the risk of not answering your question and telling you that I'll have to take that on to more senior people to contact back with you and maybe address some of your concerns, I would add that, we understand that, Lake Winnipeg is one of the world's largest freshwater bodies. It's a significant system that is, at the end of a long drainage network from multiple areas that is pretty complex and comprehensive, and that I wouldn't doubt that there's impacts from water management efforts from the province and from others that do influence lake levels and what's occurred, not just from Manitoba but from elsewhere. I think it's well understood that there's concerns on Lake Winnipeg with respect to water pollution that comes from farm runoff and other inputs that are negative to the environment and to the ecology. That's I think understood and a challenge that people are looking at to face. And there's other groups that have put that out there. But as far as a comprehensive strategy for Lake Winnipeg specifically, and the impacts of the provincial water control structures, such as the building of the 2 channels through Lac St. Martin and from Lake Manitoba into Lake Winnipeg, I think that the consultation and engagement on that is ongoing, and I believe that Water Management and Structures Division would have to have a more detailed discussion with folks on that piece there. With respect to the management of water and hydro's role, there's legislation that governs the hydro's activities and licenses them to do what they do, and we'll let the folks from Hydro speak to that specifically. But I took all those notes on what you're talking about down there, and I'm going to connect with you right after this to make sure I got your name and contact information. We'll have somebody try and connect back to you, because it's a pretty important issue that I'm sure has been brought up before, and I cannot give you a simple answer. And at the risk of sounding like some government guy giving you some mumbo jumbo up here, I'll just stop there.
I wanted to just speak a little bit about. Yeah, as I showed on my presentation, there's a chart that showed that most of the water that comes into Manitoba comes in from other jurisdictions. And so for Manitoba to try and solve the water quality problem in Lake Winnipeg, in Manitoba, it would be very difficult, because most of the runoff from the United States and from Alberta and Saskatchewan. That all goes into Lake Winnipeg, and from the Winnipeg River all contributes to the water quality in the lake. And so it's got to be more than a Manitoba problem. This has to be recognized by all users of the waterways that that Manitoba is at the bottom of the system, and that whatever happens upstream comes into Manitoba. And that's true from a flooding perspective. Every time a new drainage channel is built upstream of Lake Winnipeg in order to water off the land faster, that creates additional pressure on Lake Winnipeg to manage the flood. And so you get water into the lake that normally stay on the land and would any more months for it to run off into the. And so as we try and provide flood protection to communities upstream and get land off get the water off agricultural land, that pushes the problem just downstream. And so you have flood protection works in Alberta and Saskatchewan and in the United States that just push the problem downstream. You have projects like what's happening on Lake Manitoba, where the water levels are a concern there, and you want to get the water out of the lake faster. That puts more pressure on Lake Winnipeg. And then Lake Winnipeg pushes that water downstream onto the affected communities downstream in the Nelson River. And so this is a big problem, that you have upstream interests and downstream interests whose interests are in conflict. Lake Winnipeg is a unique project in Manitoba from Hydro's perspective, because our license with the province is not just a hydropower license, it is a flood control license. There are channels at the outlet of Lake Winnipeg in the north whose purpose is to increase the outflow from Lake Winnipeg by 50%, so that in a flood, the floodwaters are passed through the lake faster than they would otherwise be. And as a result of those, Lake Winnipeg is at a lower level in floods than it would otherwise be. And in the last big flood, it was 2 feet lower than it would have been had those channels not been there. But the consequence of that is that the communities downstream, the communities at Cross Lake and at Split Lake and at York Landing, they see that extra 50% of water. And so the flood problem, we solved the flood problem on Lake Winnipeg, but we've caused the problem downstream. And that was the choice that was made in the 1970s by the province of Manitoba at the time, that we needed to provide flood relief on Lake Winnipeg. And they did that, and the people downstream are now feeling the effects of that. And Manitoba Hydro, through its activities, has tried to accommodate those floodwaters and protect those affected communities from the impact of Lake Winnipeg regulation. And so, yes, the downstream people always are paying the price, because water flows downstream. And so if you want to get the water out, you want to mitigate the flood, there are people downstream who are going to bear the adverse impacts. It is a huge issue. And I think it'll always be that way, because nobody wants to have a flood in their backyard.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Just for a response, we'll go.
I got a supplemental comment and question. First of all, it does no good to blame other jurisdictions for the water on Lake Winnipeg in terms of pollution that's going in there. Don't worry about what other jurisdictions are doing. Worry about building that sewage plant at the north end of the city here. It's $1.3 billion and counting. And according to that strategy, it doesn't have to be implemented till 2045. On Lake Winnipeg, back in the 70s, the old people talked about a brown line on Lake Winnipeg. That brown line is moving north. That brown line is from Winnipeg, from the sewage from Lake Winnipeg. So in the 70s to now, the brown line has moved north of Papa River. That's how much Winnipeg is killing our lake. And we don't listen to your stories about, oh, blame North Dakota and Saskatchewan. No, blame Winnipeg. Selkirk, all these communities are dumping into the lake. Let's clean up our act, not worry about and point fingers. That's my response to that. The other thing is, Lake Winnipeg, up until they put the Genpeg Dam in, was 4 feet lower than since that dam has been there. So when Hydro says that they're managing and mitigating a flood on Lake Winnipeg, no. We've had a flood since 1977 when that dam went into operation. I can show you the marks on the rock. If you went to Barons River last summer, that's the normal water level, 4 or 5 feet lower than what it is 2, 3 years ago, and for the last 40 years. That black line is on the rock. I got a picture of it I can show you. So we've been under constant flood for 40 years because of the Genpeg Dam, because that's not the normal level of Lake Winnipeg. I grew up in res school, and I went to res school with people from Cross Lake. I went to school with Tommy Monias, the chief today from Cross Lake. Those people told me they were researching, because Cross Lake has big issues with hydro, that Manitoba Hydro went around Lake Winnipeg and removed all the elevation markers. They removed all the maps from this province that showed the true 715 level on Lake Winnipeg. They made a new 715 level to store more water into Lake Winnipeg than was supposed to be. And that explains why that lake is 4 or 5 feet higher, because you guys are lying and cheating about this water management stuff. Correct those problems before you continue on lying to the people on Lake Winnipeg. Go back in your records and undo what you've done there. Those are the kind of things that we know about on Lake Winnipeg and in this province. So that's my answer to your flood mitigation on Lake Winnipeg. You've caused the flood there. That flood is still there today. It'll always be there. Get rid of that Genpeg Dam, and then it'll straighten out. Go back to where it was. Thank you.
Thank you for the concerns you raised. So we have time for one more question. I believe a gentleman in the back. Did you still have a question? So we'll take one more question, and then we will close the question period for the 3 panelists. But I do want to remind everyone that their contact information is in the packages that you have. So if you have any further questions, I know they'll be happy to get in touch with you. So we'll go to one more question.
Ted Woodhouse, Fairford, one of the council from Fairford. These are my neighbors across the lake. You know, I have a colleague here, Brian Sanderson. Maybe you can wave your hand. He's over there. He's got about 4,500 to 5,000 pictures of the flood, 2011 flood. So we have a lot of record what happened to Fairford, downstream houses, downstream reserves that flooded. But back in 1958, I wasn't even born, but we have a letter that the government, the province, already had plans for this. What Barons River is talking about, 61 years later, you know, they had plans for this already, what they're doing to our area. Even the channels that they're trying to put through to the neighboring Fairford, they're south from there. They're not even considering the small lakes, Lake St. Martin. That was one of the big areas. That's where we made our living, Lake Manitoba. We made our fishing, you know, Fairford had about 24, maybe 20, close to 30 farmers. There's only one now, maybe lucky 2. That's what you guys did to us. You took everything away. We made a living out of that farming. Fishing, we used to, you go on the lake, we had about 135 licenses, Brian, Lake St. Martin at one time. And you go there today, if you go and get your helicopter, go to the lake, maybe you'll see 2 on that lake today. A lot of damage. You know, when that 1960s, when the transmission line went through, we were just young boys. Our grandfather was one of the members at that time when when they made that power line go through Fairford. You know, that was less than $1,500, maybe $1,700 that they spent on that reserve to hire these men to clear the bush. That was it. That's what we got out of that. We have records of that. And there is no signatures, there is X's. Now, how much hydro is going through there? Then it's going back that way. It's coming from here, north, heading back south, going to... Right now we have about maybe 20 men from Fairford alone working in Minnesota, going to work on that other line that's going through on the east side here by Pole 3, the next one. You know, there's a lot of impact in our communities. I'm a great-grandfather. Maybe I don't look like it, but I am. But you know, I'm worried about the next generation. Yeah? My father-in-law walked from Dorsey Station right to Gillam, 5.5 years, every tower, torqued and tight by hand. And there's a few from these communities, SKO and Ebenflow, and maybe some from Burns River around this area. They put all the power lines, all natives. My dad was there too, and my uncles was there too. But guess what? After that line was done, not even one was hired to work for Manitoba Hydro, to drive around the Manitoba Hydro truck. Yeah? Not one after the job was done. That's it, the job is done, you go. Go and do some other work. Same thing with that other one, Bipo 2, eh? Yeah. Same thing, my son worked there. A lot of things happen there. I'll use an example, a white man here, sitting here, okay? He made $70 an hour, and I make $20 an hour. That's what Manitoba Hydro did. I got home, we have the same name, Ted Woodhouse Jr. and Ted Woodhouse Sr. So I opened the mail, and there's his check stub. His check stub. Why I wasn't happy. How much the government was taking away from my family. Income tax, working on reserve, and getting underpaid. Then that white man. Yeah? Why is that? There's a lot of things here that impact with this hydro. All to do with water control. We heard this lady here talking this morning, our elder. A lot of damage was done to us. You know, I look forward to, I don't know how long it's going to take. Maybe I won't be here when they do the cleanup, the damage that is done. You know, 2011 flood, those 3-4 communities downstream. Majority of them, we helped each other bury our own people in the Muskegon water, muck, because the water was so saturated, the ground. It's a lot of damage. You know, you can go and spend millions and millions and millions of dollars, all these channels, but you can't give anything back to our First Nations. We have to fight for it. That class action, they talked about $90 million. They want us to fight for that money. And that money is supposed to be free for us for compensation, what we lost in our communities. Now, there's lawyers getting involved. There's people that passed on. I just had a call when I was sitting here from my sister-in-law. He lost her son and his husband during the class action settlement. Now they're entitled for nothing. They have to get a lawyer. There's a lot of damage that Manitoba Hydro do. And Winnipeg, just to protect Winnipeg, yeah? You heard the gentleman says from Burns River, he was a chief for how many years? Exactly. So I support every comment that he made, because it's true. We know what we went through. We've been asking to upgrade our roads in our community. Nothing. There's a reserve that goes through, a pavement goes through a reserve. The other surrounding communities, they damage our road, they damage our pavement. They come in there and just put a little bit of asphalt and away they go. Yeah? And I bet you any money, if you go to one of these officials that are sitting here with Indian Affairs and Manitoba Hydro, their driveway is better than my road. You know? I'm right, eh? You know, I think you have to respect our communities, our lakes. We don't even want to eat our own fish now. Look what's happening with our deer. You know, the moose population is gone. This is all with hydro. A lot of our mooses must have drowned, or the wolves might have got them, but they're blaming us. They're blaming our own people for spotlighting. It's not that. To close off, I'm very little bit disappointed in some areas. You know, as communities, this place should have been all packed because everybody's affected. We had a negotiator, Indian Affairs. I feel somebody touching me here. I think that's Indian Affairs. But you know, we had Eric Magginson from Indian Affairs, negotiator from Ottawa, sign agreement in principle, get this out of the way. Guess what? After his retirement, he's gone. After June, we're no longer in business with any more future flooding or negotiations. Guess what happened? After that was done, he went for his nice cruise and everything. He comes back and works for a project manager for Lakes and Martin communities. Come on, what's happening? Yeah? We have a picture of him working for Lakes and Martin First Nation, being a project manager. And he was our flood negotiator for the Department of Indian Affairs from Ottawa, under Maddox. There's something wrong. That's a big conflict of interest right there. First you go and set everything set up, then he goes and gets hired for, I don't know how much he was making an hour. But you know, I didn't know I was going to speak today, but I think Brian has all the evidence, the pictures of the videos. I don't know how many hours we spent on there trying to protect our community. We lost lots. Will never be full compensated, you know. It really bothers me. I wish you men lived on what we went through. I wish you know what we went through, you know. Now they give us few houses as compensating our certain areas to cover the damage that was done. If we didn't do this, like what the lady talked about, the dikes in Lake Manitoba, that would have been the first units. Reserves would have went underwater. But you wouldn't believe the pictures that we have, live pictures of Fairford, what happened on Lakes Martin and Little Sask. You know, somebody to be removed from their homestead where they were brought up to somewhere else. You'll never forget that. So, as a leader in my community, I never thought I was going to speak here today, but you know, I'd like to hear. It's kind of bothers me. We're here 7, 8 years later, but we should have been here 8 years earlier, half plans. In January, February, March, 5, 6 months, Brian, myself, we were monitoring the water at the dam, and nobody believed us that they were going to have a flood. In June, the water was flying over the big, I think it's about 12 to 15 feet deep, the bridge there. Kent, you know how our lower Fairford Bridge looks? That water was flying right over. So, just so we can have more power for hydro. You good, thank you.
I'd like to thank you for sharing your concerns and stories with the panel here. And again, I'm a relatively low-level government functionary, so I couldn't necessarily speak to all those really important issues. But I'll share a story with you, so to let you know that I kind of understand where you're coming from. So I joined Manitoba EMO in September 2013 after I retired from the Army. And I was heading up to Waterhen to go meet with some folks up there about some potential ice jam flooding issues, frazzle ice flooding things that were going to happen that fall because of how high the Waterhen River was. And I got my brand new EMO truck and my EMO shirt and jacket, and I jumped in the truck and I was heading up Highway 6, and I stopped in St. Laurent to get gas. And I was a big smile on my face, went there, got a coffee, and all the people in this gas station looked at me like I had 3 heads. And like they wanted to chop them all off. And so I was like, oh, I thought it was friendly Manitoba, I guess not. Then I kept driving up, and I noticed at the Fairford control structure there was a bunch of fellas out there fishing. And they looked like they were catching in a bunch of whales out there. And I was thinking, stop, I like to fish. And I pull over, and I kind of called down to them, hey, guys, how's it going? And they looked at me like I had these same 3 heads in there. And they give me this, like, who's this guy? And so I get to Waterhen, and I meet a guy named Mark Allard. You guys probably know him, some of you from that region. He's Region 4, Manitoba Highways or whatever, and a bunch of these other staff. And I said, yeah, geez, man, I got the stink eye look from these folks in St. Laurent and up at Fairford. And they said, I'm sorry, you have a government marked truck from Manitoba and you actually stopped and talked to those people? Dude, you're taking your life in your own hands. And they explained to me that 2 years before, with the flood of 2011, the significant impacts that had occurred there, and also along Lake Manitoba, and especially with those communities, Fairford, Lac St. Martin, and all the way down to Dauphin River. And I was kind of schooled on those issues by those guys, and they kind of said, you really got to be aware that there's a lot of concerns by people in those communities, long-standing ones, and also new ones that have come up with some of the events we've had to deal with flooding and preparedness and mitigation and all that. So I do understand that there's a lot of varying concerns, and they're not just a broad base of them. Some of them are pretty deep and importantly entrenched concerns that you have on some of these issues. And I was writing a bucket load of notes here that I'll make sure that I get back to Ruth Eden and her boss and our minister, that they understand that these concerns are still ever present. And I don't have any answers for you, because I certainly am not that kind of guy that can talk about those significant issues, but I do get it, and I really understand it. So thank you for bringing that up, and it won't go unnoticed.
All right, thank you. And with that, I would just like to thank again Mark Gagne, Glenn Howell, and David Cormie for being here with us today, and also to remind everyone that in your packages, all their contact information is there. So if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to contact them. And thank you again, gentlemen. So at this time, we'll take a quick break. It's 2:15, so we'll reconvene at 2:30. And we'll be hearing from Michael Anderson from Manitoba Kitinawi Ogamaganok, as well as Byron Williams, the Director for Public Interest Law, Center of Legal Aid, Manitoba. And I was also informed that we were going to be hearing from Chief Monias from Pimicikamak, but he sends his regrets and he won't be able to join us today. So 15-minute break, and we'll meet back here at 2:30. All right, welcome back, everyone. So continuing on with our agenda, I would like to call up the former director for Manitoba Kitinawi Ogamaganak, Michael Anderson, and he's going to be giving his presentation on the two worlds of flooding. You ready to go, Mike? Yeah. All right. 15 minutes. I'll give you more.
Bonjour, Adlanate, Tansi. It's a pleasure to have been invited to speak with you. At the moment, I'm not working with Manitoba Kiiwetinoyoki Makanak, but I did for 29 years as the Director of Research for the Natural Resources Secretariat. As another comment and background, I would mention that I've been working on water-related and hydro issues in Manitoba, mainly for Northern First Nations, for 35 years. And given that I don't have an official capacity, I suppose it gives me the right to speak bluntly today, and I'm going to try to enjoy doing that. I will enjoy doing that. The issue about water management and flooding and the questions that I was asked about what my observations were during my time with MKO and then what might be done for collaborative water management, I'll try to speak to in my presentation as I go. I also have some fragments of other presentations that I'd like to share if I have the opportunity, noting that Chief Monias isn't present with us. So I've called this the two worlds of flooding, and it really largely flows from the floods of 2010 and 2011. And in that, as Mr. Cormie and others have talked to you about, Manitoba is the recipient of an enormous amount of water from watersheds in the United States, Ontario, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and northern Manitoba. And of course, with the Churchill River diversion, the water flows south through South Indian Lake, the Notagi control structure, into the Burntwood River, and then into the Nelson River, just downstream of the current Kelsey generating station. So that's a lot of water. But one of the things that I wanted to comment on is that, right at the outset, is that Manitoba Hydro's evidence to the PUB and the Clean Environment Commission is that they're able to control the levels of water in their system, about 95% of the water flows in the system. So this concept that there's an act of God that we're dealing with in these systems really needs to be counterpointed against the significant regulation and storage of water throughout the system. Manitoba Hydro, which I'll talk about in a little bit, operates using, it calculates the energy, the reservoir energy and storage for 18 reservoirs within this area on the screen. So when it adds up how much water it's got for producing power through the year, it's counting up the reservoirs everywhere to determine what its forecast energy generation for the year will be. Mr. Williams will recall a year where we were facing a rate increase application before the Public Utilities Board in which Manitoba Hydro said its reservoirs were very low, and that I had walked Manitoba Hydro through a cross-examination of the current status of its reservoirs, and the end result was that the PUB denied that rate increase on the basis that there was in fact adequate water to produce adequate revenues for that particular year. So we're talking about an intensely regulated and managed water system across a very large section of the central North American continent. What I describe as the two worlds of flooding is that there's a world of flooding related to water diversion to protect urban property values, mainly through the operation of Lake of the Prairies, Portage Diversion, and Lake Manitoba. This is what has caught a lot of attention, largely because when there is flooding in Lake Manitoba and Lake St. Martin, it ends up resulting in evacuations, which causes a lot of government intervention and, of course, most importantly, difficulty to the First Nations and the communities that are affected by it. The other world of flooding, though, that I wanted to talk about is related to water diversion and storage to produce hydropower, as I've been describing, that the hydro system and the 18 reservoirs in the U.S., Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba providing energy to the system. So while there is large-scale overland flooding in the south, there's also significant flooding that occurs in the north, which is often not as well understood or even known. During the Great Flood of 2010 and 2011, there were exactly 2, I think, subject to check, famous phrase of my friend Mr. Williams, articles in the Winnipeg Free Press about the northern flooding, and of course daily news on the southern flooding. Mr. Cormier was talking about the drainage basins, and here you can see the pictures of the division using their own maps about how they calculate the energy input into their system across the prairies. What's important is that in some years, Lake Manitoba has more reservoir energy and storage than Cedar Lake does behind the Grand Rapids Dam. So even though it's not discussed as part of their operations in ordinary terms, it is calculated as part of their energy storage. And as I said, sometimes greater than the energy storage behind the Grand Rapids project. In general, Manitoba Hydro has been keeping average Lake Winnipeg and other hydro-controlled reservoirs at levels historically closer to maximum levels, meaning that the averages are changing. The observation that I would make is that partly because the export price of power has gone down so substantially over the last 10 years in particular, that Manitoba Hydro is trying to make up the difference on volume, selling all the power it can produce. So that puts it in a position where it's trying to hang on and run and operate with more water in the system. So if you look at the water levels, the average levels in reservoirs like Cedar Lake, Lake Winnipeg, and others, the levels are higher than the long-term average. That might be viewed as something that's a result of climate change, but keep in mind that hydro controls the reservoir levels through the operation of its facilities. So those levels are being created by the operation of the system. With the increase in flooding conditions exacerbated by climate change, this practice of artificially high water along many water systems in Manitoba has negatively impacted First Nations. A key consideration about flooding issues is that government and hydro do not engage in integrated water regime management planning. They don't. Manitoba is an interesting jurisdiction because essentially the northern system is operated primarily for hydropower production, and considerations for releases for fish, wildlife, for transportation for people, water quality, and other uses isn't factored into the operation. Essentially, hydro relies on its agreements that it's entered into with multiple First Nations to allow it to operate the project as it will for maximum generation. There are terms that are used in the northern system like predetermined compensation, meaning if a water level goes up or below a certain fixed level, mainly higher more lately, then there's a formula that kicks in and payments are produced, checks are mailed to the First Nation, and that's how hydro resolves the impacts of those operations. What's important about that, and I'll talk about that in a bit, is that the impacts on fish, wildlife, and other facts are not considered during that, except Hydro's view is that it would have been considered during the global negotiations in the case of the comprehensive agreements for Kinoseosipi, Nissechuasik, Tatasqueyak, and York Factory. And the outstanding agreement and the Northern Flood Agreement, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is also affected by this. Hydro in particular actively discourages even the notion, this is my observation, of multi-party water regime planning and management, even though provisions for such activities are included in the Forbay agreements. What I mean to say is that the agreements provide for First Nation acceptance of the operation of the project, in quotes. It's a defined term in the agreements. The project is defined as basically the whole Manitoba Hydro system. So the First Nation agrees that Hydro operates the system in accordance with the provisions for mitigation and compensation set out in the agreements. Generally, the idea that you can run the dams differently to provide for fish and wildlife water quality values is not a factor in their operations. There's no planning mechanism to deal with that. Essentially, the water system has been monetized, and that impacts have been converted into cash compensation either through the principal amount, capital amounts in the settlement agreements, or in ongoing compensation through predetermined compensation and so forth, those kinds of automatic mechanisms. A next step in processes would be that water management planning for multiple use, including flood protection, water storage, and Manitoba hydro operations should be included. For example, in the Forebay Agreement with the PA, there's an express provision that Hydro and the band agree to establish within 3 months of the effective date a water regime review and consultation committee, hereinafter called the committee, through which the parties agree to undertake a process of detailed and genuine consultation in respect of any proposed modifications to the project, alterations of the water regime, keywords, and any applications to amend the license and potential employment and training opportunities and so on. There's also a provision in a subsection of the agreement with the PA to engage in consultations with SaskPower. Now, Opaskwayak Cree Nation has a sandbagging machine that it uses, that it purchased, because of the persistent flooding of the low areas along the Saskatchewan River. Even though the releases from the E.B. Campbell Dam can be planned in such a way that large slugs of water are not being released through the marshes en route to the PA every year, and greater planning can be taken to mitigate potential flooding at Opaskwayak through working with SaskPower on releases upstream. This simply isn't done. This kind of integrated planning for multiple purposes isn't done because, of course, if you reduce the storage of water in E.B. Campbell, it has the effect of reducing on long-term energy production if the water is released at a time that's not convenient for hydro utilities to generate power. So this is a key idea, this idea that the water systems need to be run. By comparison, in the United States Pacific Northwest, the Bonneville Power Administration and all the allied utilities have to operate their system for multiple use. They operate a thing every year they call a fish flush to allow salmon fry to move downstream. So they're required to do releases to allow fish spawning and the movement of fish fry downstream. When that happens, the utilities in the U.S. Pacific Northwest send their energy to BC Hydro, who then operates its system with it while storing water in the BC Hydro system. So people are shifting energy and water values throughout the system in order to provide multiple values. Manitoba is one of the first few jurisdictions in North America that's allowed to run an entire integrated hydro system flat out for power without having to consider all these other considerations. Compensation for flooding, this is the southern system as well, based on the principles in the Red River Floodway Act and Water Resources Administration Act and similar legislation. Both of these pieces of legislation provide a requirement to provide compensation to parties that are affected by artificial flooding due to the operation of the Red River Floodway, or in the case of the Water Resources Administration Act, the Shellmouth Reservoir and downstream operations. Those amendments occurred in 2011 for the Water Resources Administration Act, but there are principles of compensation. However, the statutes don't apply them to First Nation lands, people, or property. That is, that the decision to use the portage diversion in Red River Floodway is based on minimizing flood damage in Winnipeg and in Brandon. Now, this is a really important concept. The decisions to operate and open up the portage diversion are based on a concept and a forecast of potential damage in the city of Winnipeg. So in one area, you have a very high economic cash value for potential damage and restoration, and they're literally moving the water into an area where they deem the damage to be of a lesser value. That's really important as an idea. They're not damaging these folks over here, and they're sending the water over here, going through Lake Manitoba and Lake St. Martin, and affecting all the First Nations that are along those lakes and those river systems that interconnect them to Lake Winnipeg. Now, the concept here is that there are some very significant values being protected in the city of Winnipeg. I was appointed to the Flood Review Task Force for the 2010-2011 flood, and one of the very first things I said when I walked in the door was, can we please get a calculation of the values that were protected in the city of Winnipeg by the operation of the portage diversion? Can we get a cash number for that? The concept being is that conceptually, the First Nations that are being affected by it have an interest and a share in in those values, as well as in the direct replacement of properties that are damaged. So there's other folks that are benefiting, and the benefits of that should be shareable. The provincial legislation provides compensation for artificial flooding related to the floodway, and it should apply to First Nation, and this should be part of the dialogue that's taking place today. We should also recognize, importantly, that the Indigenous Treaty and Northern Flood Agreement right to food sovereignty has been affected and adversely affected by flooding. This is a very significant right. The ability to feed oneself from the lands around them in fish, game, medicines, berries, and other plants. The flooding has caused considerable damage in the southern system in Lake Manitoba, Lake St. Martin, and Lake Winnipeg, but also along the entire developed waterway in northern Manitoba. Whether it's the Churchill Diversion, Burntwood River, the Nelson River in particular, have been dealing with persistently high water levels and massive erosion of the shorelines from, in particular, the Genpeg generating station and water control structure all the way to the coast. That mitigation and restoration of fish and wildlife populations and habitat that have been damaged by flooding needs to be part of the dialogue. When the large-scale flooding happened up north, there was no investigation officially of the scale of damage along the Churchill River and the Nelson River and its connected systems, or in the south, even though that was requested by multiple parties. And that to reconcile the impacts and adverse effects on the right to food sovereignty and reduced harvest of fish, game, berries, and plants and medicines should also be part of the dialogue. Even though there's restoration work that are still being slowly continued along the Lake Manitoba and Lake St. Martin system, there's virtually no discussion of restoration caused by large-scale flooding along the entire system of habitats and populations. Now, I know that Grand Chief Settee this morning briefly had mentioned the forgotten flood of 2011, and with your permission, I'd like to just refer to a little bit of the presentation that was delivered by then Chief Settee in Geneva during the Universal Periodic Review of Canada before the United Nations. Every 5 years they review a group of nation states, and this was Canada's turn to be examined. In 2011, it was the highest water levels that the community at Pimachikamak at Cross Lake had ever experienced in their lives for most of them, 7,500 citizens. And particularly at the same time the flood was occurring in Lake Manitoba and Lake St. Martin, there was a huge flood going on up north. The water levels, the Nelson River is the outlet of Lake Winnipeg. It's fed by 6 major watersheds, which we've already discussed. And the Genpeg control structure at the outlet of Lake Winnipeg is where all of that goes together for the water that's flowing into Lake Winnipeg. In 2011, these water levels were controlled discharges from Lake Winnipeg. Even though the gates at Genpeg were up and wide open, it was still part of the operation. The water levels of the Nelson River at Cross Lake are controlled by hydro in the province as part of the Lake Winnipeg Regulation Project. And they're controlled through the operation both of Genpeg Generating Station and the Genpeg control structure. So all that water flowing through Lake Manitoba, Lake St. Martin, from the southern system, Red River, Winnipeg River, all ends up in Lake Winnipeg and controlled at the north end by Genpeg, one set of structures. The structures are at the north end of the lake, and then it feeds into Playgreen Lake, the water systems at Kinoseo-Sipi and Pimachikamak, Cross Lake. These flood systems, as I was saying, operate primarily to control flood damage in the city of Winnipeg. And these two systems together create what are commonly known as floodways. But up north, when all that water is pouring through the Genpeg control structure and generating station, they're not really usually called floodways, but they are floodways. Hydro is a license to operate Lake Winnipeg between 711 and 715 feet. The supplemental license says that when they get to 715, they have to open Genpeg wide, pull the gates up, and let the water flow through until the lake level is restored. And there were some comments about the effects of that earlier. And the water level of Lake Winnipeg was about 717 feet between May and September of 2011, and was expected to remain above 715 feet until the early winter of 2011, which is what it did. When we look at the observed water levels on the lake, by the way, these kinds of charts are not available on Hydro's website at the present time. These are saved charts that I had. In 2011, it had exceeded 1,717 feet only 4 times since 1913. 3 occurrences were prior to Lake Winnipeg regulation in 1976, and the 4th was in 2011. So you can see with this chart the average water levels in Lake Winnipeg that were occurring at that time. What was important about it is that high water levels in Lake Winnipeg were higher, occurred earlier, and were sustained for a period more than twice as long than in the floods or high water levels in either 1997 or 2005. And what's critical about it, I wanted to point out, is this. Manitoba Hydro typically in spring, late April, tries to lift Lake Winnipeg to within about 6 inches of the maximum operating range. And so the so what of the story that I was just explaining is that when you're only dealing with literally this, Lake Winnipeg's a big body of water, but you're dealing with 6 inches on the top. So an unanticipated precipitation event like the weather bomb in the end of May 2011 really has nowhere to go. What's important about this is that everyone knew what was happening on the prairies. The uncontrolled storages were high, they were filled with water. Environment Canada clearly showed that the soil was filled with water, the ground was wet, and that the reservoirs, whether they were those 18 reservoirs that were throughout the system, were all near their high levels. So there was literally nowhere for the water to go except across the surface of the land, and that's exactly what we saw. So instead of trying to mitigate the potential for an unanticipated precipitation event by adjusting the reservoirs below GenPeg, the Lake Winnipeg was raised as usual to its high level within 6 inches of its maximum operating range, and then the rest that we can see is history. And we're still dealing with that. Now, the floodway, even though the gates were kept fully open during that period of time, it was described then as the Nelson River floodway. So we had 2 floodways. We had the floodway operating on the Red River. We had the second floodway, really, which was the operation of the Portage Diversion and the operation of Lake Manitoba and Lake St. Martin. But we also had another floodway on the Nelson River. What was important about this is that even though the floodway was being, the Portage Diversion was being pushed at about 32,000 cubic feet per second, flowing through the GenPeg generating station and at the community of Cross Lake was approximately 180,000 cubic feet per second. 6 times the Portage Diversion was tearing through the Nelson River at Cross Lake, heading downstream toward the Nelson. At the same time, Manitoba Hydro was unloading water from South Indian Lake into the northern system at Missy Falls into the Churchill River, and it was about 80,000 cubic feet per second. So while we had this enormous flood in the south, we also had these record high discharges in the north, creating 2 floodways, one on the Nelson River and one on the Churchill, none of which was really understood, publicized, or studied. And so we had all of this damage to shorelines, fish, wildlife, water quality, and so on, taking place without any examination officially in the north, even though the First Nations asked for it. In Alberta, they describe a floodway as a floodplain that during a flood is the deepest, fastest, and most destructive flow of water. Well, we all were familiar with that both in the south and in the north, those 2 worlds of water. And the BC Ministry of Environment describes a floodway as the channel of the water course and portions of a floodplain reasonably required to convey the designated flood. So in my picture of 2 worlds of flooding, we had enormous floodway operations occurring in the north along the Nelson River and Churchill River system. And we had the existing flooding, of course, in the Portage operation of the Portage Diversion and the other systems. One of the things that I had wanted to show you quickly in wrapping up is that these charts showing water level operations by Manitoba Hydro are no longer available readily on their website. This was showing record high levels at Cross Lake in terms of both the operations and forecasts. It was showing the difference in the water level between the historic average, which I was describing, and the actual operations. And these are important because they give you a picture of what's going on in these reservoirs. And the inundations at Cross Lake reached a higher level at the static inundation level or the agreement level during that period of time as well. So one of the things about these is that in looking at how we operate the system, we try to make sure that these types of water level charts and graphs are understood and brought into the discussion. I know that there were some discussions about forecasts today, but there's also the important discussions of long-term average water levels and how the changes in the water regime are occurring that create these record levels on the system. So what we had going down from Nelson River is that downstream on the Nelson River floodway was a nearly complete loss of boat launching, docking, and marina facilities, similar to the south. Nearly complete loss of swimming beaches and shoreline recreational facilities, as was in the south. Impacts to migratory birds, fish, and wildlife. Extensive flooding and drowning of shoreline timber and plants, including berries and medicines, as in the south. And significant reduction in infringement of the exercise of Aboriginal Treaty and Northern Flood Agreement fishing, hunting, and harvesting rights. So in the dialogue of discussing flood preparation and responses to very high water levels, it's important to realize that the water system in Manitoba, both in the south and the north, is managed and regulated through a system of reservoirs and control structures. So when decisions are made to put water into a certain body of water, it's because they're looking at values, whether it's for property protection in the city of Winnipeg or Brandon or power generation. That the effect of it is this very lengthy list, in addition to homes in the south and entire community areas, all of which need to be on the dialogue, in the dialogue for discussion and incorporation into any concept of integrated water resource management to ensure that all of these factors are included, because the losses are enormous and they haven't been fully compensated either in the north or the south to the point where everyone is living in conditions that were similar to those pre-flooding in 2010 and 2011. And Manitoba Hydro in particular in the north is continuing its operations in such a way as to optimize water levels and power generation. So, comments for future discussion on collaborative management. This long list of issues are very important. True integrated water resource planning, so that all of these factors are taken into consideration in planning the releases of water, are critical. And applying the principles in the Red River Floodway Act and the Water Resources Administration Act for compensation for artificial flooding are also essential. So with that, thanks for letting me share a few words today about the similarities in the two worlds of flooding, how we can all work together, both north and south, and to ensure that all of these types of issues are incorporated into any dialogue on integrated resource management planning or collaborative water resource management planning as you were describing it. Egwese, kinanaskamitin, masicho, miigwech. A second, don't touch anything. I just use the cursors. Yeah. What do you want, Byron? Your power? Do you want your PowerPoint, or do you want your?
Just to answer your question, there will be opportunity to ask both Michael and Byron questions after Byron's presentation. So we will open the floor for a quick question period after Byron's presentation. So we'll save all questions till after that, and both of them will be up here on the panel, and we'll allow time for that. Yeah. If you wish to get any of the presentations, please let Keely know, and she can email, if you want to provide your email with her, she can email you a copy of all of the... Yeah, so all copies of presentations will be emailed to all those registered. So without further ado, welcome Byron Williams. And again, we'll be opening up the floor for questions after his presentation.
Thank you. And Michael took you up to about 2011. I want to start in 2015 because that's when the Clean Environment Commission took a hard look at regulation of the Lake Winnipeg regulation system. And it made a couple of important conclusions. One, as we've heard today, is that water management in Manitoba is very poorly coordinated. Another significant conclusion it made is that Manitoba Hydro is regulated with a very light hand. And then, unlike other jurisdictions in North America, where there's more integrated resource management, where there's more integrated planning, in Manitoba, it's very much a very different system. So the question I've asked in my presentation is, given the findings that we had a poorly coordinated water management system in 2015, given the finding that Manitoba Hydro was regulated with a light hand, where are we now? Are we standing still or are we moving forward? And the AMC, when they approached our center to do this presentation, they said, first of all, tell these folks who you are, and then talk a little bit about collaborative water management. And I'm going to do that. We were asked to share what we have learned, but we thought it might be more helpful to share what the Clean Environment Commission found, because we think those are important findings. And in doing so, I've asked not only what have we learned about good water practice management and how it's not conducted in Manitoba, but also, are there any strategic tools? If we want to move the bar forward, are there things that we can do as Manitobans, or you can do as First Nations, to incent Manitoba Hydro and the province to get with modern water management practices? So just for you, our center, I'm not going to do too much advertising. I have not been around since 1982, although I look like it today. But we represent groups on public interest matters, including environmental matters. We worked with the AMC in their representations to the expert panel review on federal environmental legislation. You heard from Elder Mary this morning with her water song, for which we certainly thank her. We worked with elders like Elder Mary as they shared the Great Banding Law at Turtle Lodge. And we have been part of every major review of Manitoba Hydro activities from 2004 to 2018, including Wisquatum, the Lake Winnipeg regulation, the recent Nelson River Regional Cumulative Effects Assessment. I did want to talk, although it's mostly been identified today, in terms of what are some of the key factors driving flooding in Manitoba. We know the drainage issue, both from Michael in his very persuasive presentation, but even Mr. Cormy, we've identified as well the role that Lake Winnipeg regulation is playing, especially on the Nelson River. I haven't heard much talk today about the Churchill River diversion or the augmented flow program, but that is clearly a significant factor, and obviously human-influenced climate change. What have we learned about water management in Manitoba? These are not my conclusions. These are the conclusions of the Clean Environment Commission in 2015. It talked about many projects and programs dealing with management, planning, and protection of water in the Lake Winnipeg Nelson River watershed. But there are no specific set of management goals or policy objectives uniting all these programs. And moreover, most of these programs are local in nature, without a great deal of consideration of long-range results downstream. And indeed, although there were a lot of programs focused on Lake Winnipeg, they paid little attention to water issues further downstream on the Nelson. So the conclusions of the Clean Environment Commission, poorly coordinated and limited consideration of downstream consequences. And what about Manitoba Hydro? Importantly, what it concluded is that the informal way that we manage water in Manitoba, whether Lake Winnipeg regulation or other river systems, is in stark contrast to other jurisdictions. In those other jurisdictions, there are multi-stakeholder water management planning processes. In terms of Lake Winnipeg regulation itself, the Clean Environment Commission observed that there are only a few conditions on those Lake Winnipeg regulation licenses, and conditions such as the minimum flow requirement or maximum rate of change have never been rigorously assessed in any public planning process. Never. The fourth bullet on this page is interesting because it speaks, as Michael did, of priorities, conditions, and trade-offs being very much determined by Manitoba Hydro without public scrutiny or a consideration of the broader public interest. And interestingly, and Mr. Cormie, to his credit, was part of that process. In the hearing itself, Manitoba Hydro acknowledged the deficiencies in the current Lake Winnipeg regulation license and indicated that they were open to more modern approaches and to examining practices in other jurisdictions. So the question is, given the acknowledgement that we're badly out of step of good North American practice, given the calamitous things we've heard from Michael and from others, including the questions in the previous panel, what has changed? I did want to talk about whether are there good examples of good practice examples in North America. And one thing that caught our attention, both in the Lake Winnipeg regulation process as well as the recent review of the Nelson River, was community members speaking about the need for greater First Nation involvement. The first quote here is from Chief Henderson from Saugeen in 2015, asking why weren't First Nations on the boards regulating Lake Winnipeg. The second bullet is from an individual from Cross Lake saying, quite logically, we have to have more say in how these dams are operated because we feel the impacts every day. And in 2018, York Factory had a really impressive submission to the Clean Environment Commission talking about how to seek protection for ASCII, including Indigenous control over the development of land and resources. If we're looking for good practice in Canada, we probably have to look north to the Northwest Territories or to the Yukon. And there's a really interesting document that the Northwest Territories has developed, their Northern Water Stewardship Strategy, which was developed in 2010, and then recently the second iteration of that plan was developed in 2016. It had an Aboriginal steering committee. It made sure that provision of the treaties and agreements should prevail, and it had clearly identified goals and approaches. Michael spoke of some other good examples. He spoke of Bonneville Power, and that's under the US federal energy regulatory process. In this PowerPoint, we identify some good examples also from Lake Ontario. The common denominator in these good practices is that they require considerations of environmental needs and water management decisions. They have provision to incorporate stakeholder and community voices, and they have regular knowledge-based monitoring. Just to finish off, I want to talk about, this is all lovely in theory, and we have a lot of knowledge of the problems. And the Clean Environment Commission and indeed Manitoba Hydro were frank in 2015 in saying we don't have good practice now. But to my knowledge, not much has changed. So are there any opportunities to push the envelope? Are there any tools First Nations might use to try and bring Manitoba, the province of Manitoba, the Government of Canada, and Manitoba Hydro to a modern approach of water management that truly recognizes the need for free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations, which truly recognizes their need to be important decision makers in this process? One of the important trigger points I want to flag for you is that there are a bunch of Manitoba hydro projects that need to be relicensed. Back in the late 50s, in the 60s, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, these Manitoba hydro projects came into play with 50-year licenses at a time when the idea of free, prior, and informed consent was not acknowledged by Canada or Manitoba Hydro. At a time when there wasn't modern environmental planning. A lot of these projects have to be relicensed. And the two quotes that I've got for you on this page, one is from the Clean Environment Commission in 2015 saying, hydro's got 15 generating stations in the province, a bunch of which will be subject to relicensing under the Water Powers Act. Again, in 2018, it's talking about relicensing processes for Lake Winnipeg regulation, the Churchill River diversion, and all those generating, or some of those major generating stations on the Nelson. Those appear to me, as an outsider, to be significant opportunities to re-engage, to try, we can't correct history, but to try and redress history and to lever those opportunities, the consultation and accommodation that should flow in that relicensing process on behalf of First Nations. So that, to me, is an important opportunity. This print is too small, and I apologize for this, but I also note that the Clean Environment Commission made a lot of good recommendations, including for southern Manitoba. It said that there should be specific management goals and policy objectives for Lake Winnipeg. It said that there should be an environmental assessment of key operations such as Shellmouth and the Assiniboia River diversion at Portage. It said that the government of Manitoba should require environmental licenses for Lake Winnipeg regulation, as well as an assessment of other hydro projects under the Environment Act. So what has Manitoba, the province of Manitoba, done with those recommendations? I'm not sure. I haven't heard a lot of public movement in that regard. At the federal level, Bill C-69 is still before the Senate, but that is a piece of legislation that they're looking at reviewing and changing federal environmental assessment. And one of the potential tools for First Nations in Manitoba might be a regional cumulative effects assessment of hydro operations in Manitoba. Section 93(1) of that act, in our opinion, may give enough tools to trigger a review. Another tool is the words of Manitoba Hydro in the 2015 Lake Winnipeg regulation process. And here you have the Clean Environment Commission quoting from Manitoba Hydro. In order for Hydro to have a social license for its project, it is willing to participate in development of a modern process for the review of Lake Winnipeg regulation prior to the application for its renewal license. Such a new process may have greater room for public consultation and a greater attempt to balance different needs and values. That balancing that Michael noted is sorely missed today and is desperately needed. And the corporation stated it believed that such a process should also be developed to license renewals for the Churchill River diversion, Kelsey, Kettle, Long Spruce, and Limestone, as well as projects on the Saskatchewan River and on the Winnipeg as well. So those were, certainly from our client's perspective, the promise of Manitoba Hydro during the Lake Winnipeg regulation. We have very powerful findings from the Clean Environment Commission that something is amiss in Manitoba. You know it on the ground in your communities, what is going on as well. So certainly from our perspective, there are some strategic opportunities to push forward to a renewed relationship in terms of water management in the province. I didn't say so at the start, and I should have. We are greatly appreciative of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs for inviting us here today, and especially to be on Treaty 1 territory. It's much appreciated, so thank you.
All right, thank you, Byron and Michael, for your presentations. So we will open the floor up for questions. I just want to remind everyone that we only have about 15 minutes for a question period. So just to be mindful and respectful of everyone's time, we want to try and get as many questions in as possible. So I will be kind of strict in allowing a 5-minute maximum, and I will be letting you know when the time is almost up. So just to be mindful of that, we still have one more presenter on our agenda for today, so we want to, of course, give him the opportunity to speak as well. So if anyone has any questions for Michael or Byron.
Both Mike and Byron, thank you for your presentations. I had 2 questions. I think in general, from the First Nations perspective, we often see and know and feel what is wrong out there. And everybody keeps telling us what's wrong. We keep feeling what's wrong. And, but my question is how do we move forward? How do we do this? That's what we need to know. Because it seems like fragmentation is the best way. That's often been the approach of government when it comes to First Nations. And to get us working against each other, fighting against each other, and giving us our own battles in our own areas that we become so overwhelmed with what we're dealing with that we can never seem to get together collectively. That's one question. And the other thing too is in regards to Manitoba Hydro, they have a number of licenses, as you'd mentioned, Byron, in your presentation, that are coming up for renew. My question is that with the current government, they have a very strong push in the sense of moving forward with the privatization of Manitoba Hydro. With these license renewals, like, what are the impacts with that? Like, how do we move forward in the sense of if they get if Manitoba Hydro gets privatized, and looking at the past projects that are upcoming for renewal? And for myself, coming from South Indian Lake in regards to the Churchill River, this is huge for us. It's still an ongoing issue. So in regards to those 2 things, I guess that would be the thing, is like, how do we move forward? We know everything that's wrong, but how do we move forward collectively as First Nations, as governments, as, you know, all of us that are being impacted by Manitoba Hydro, whether it's in the south, north, whether it's central Manitoba? How do we all move forward? And again, how does the potential privatization of Manitoba Hydro with their license renewal going to, like, you know, what are the impacts of that? So those are the 2 questions. Thanks.
Thank you for the question. I also belatedly want to thank AMC for the invitation, and I'm happy to be on Treaty 1 territory today. The key is this assumption about the operation having a collective view of how the waterways should be managed in an integrated way with First Nations, who are rights holders. And it's important to keep in mind that Manitoba Hydro is a licensee. They're dealing with discretionary rights granted by the Crown over First Nation lands. And so the rights that are affected, both in food sovereignty, in reserved lands, and other lands, traditional territory, are significant and need to be incorporated into the argument. One of the other things is to address, as a beginning concept, the idea that the high water levels are all entirely uncontrolled. They're acts of God. They're managed. So to walk into the discussions with the government and with Manitoba Hydro, setting out terms and conditions for the application of Section 35 rights, the protection of them, for the engagement of the duty to consult on water operating decisions, and also to incorporate FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent, all of these elements into the picture instead of just reacting to the high water levels. This whole dialogue, this very robust picture, including this list that I was explaining, is important. I'd like to use two examples dealing with water management decisions that describe why First Nations, government, and hydro need to establish conditions. The first is actually a low water circumstance dealing with the possibility to change the operation of the Island Falls generating station on the Churchill River. It's the only river generating station on the Churchill. It was determined in 1975 that by operating white sand control structure on the Reindeer River and the Island Falls station intentionally for maximum fish and wildlife benefits, Island Falls generating station would only lose about 3% of its average annual generation. Now that's nothing compared to the downstream damage that's occurring at Matthias-Colomb Cree Nation all the way to Leaf Rapids, the rapids, not the town. So it means that simply by changing the way the dam is run, a lot of the downstream impacts would be mitigated or reversed. So Manitoba Hydro could easily provide the 3% energy to Sask Power through some kind of a power sharing arrangement and heal the river. That's the kind of thinking to go on. The assumption that the rivers can't be changed needs to be swept away. The other example was the 2003 low water sequence on Split Lake when Manitoba Hydro had low water in its system and was trying to store it. It shut the taps off of the Nodigi control structure, the outlet of South Indian Lake. The water level for Split Lake just turned into a bucket shape on a graph. The MV Joe Keeper was beached for a while, you may recall that. And when the York Factory First Nation attempted to push back on that, the response from Hydro at first was a check for predetermined compensation. But in fact, the community was worrying about its water supply, the operation of the ferry, and so on. When the First Nation together went to go visit the government, then Ministers Ashton and Sale said, it's not Hydro's lake. Pounded the table 3 times, actually, and said it's not Hydro's lake, stood up at the meeting and phoned the chairman of Manitoba Hydro and said, looked at me and said, Mike, which dam should we release the water from, Nodigi or Genpeg, to get to Split Lake fastest? And they were on the phone to the chair of Hydro telling him to let some water go. So these kinds of emergency events were actually engineered, and there's a cross-examination that I did of Mr. Cormier in the record of the Public Utilities Board confirming that that was an ordinary system planning decision that resulted in the suspension of the ferry service MV Joe Keeper between Split Lake and York Factory. Where I'm going with this 2 sets of stories is that integrated water resource management has to be the idea, that it's not Hydro's lake. It's not the province's water system to manage, to offset damages in Winnipeg and Brandon and completely inundate a number of First Nations communities. The concept that that's appropriate and doable under the current management framework is inappropriate. Byron is saying that there's no balance, there's no integration of these ideas. In my example that I used for the Bonneville Power Administration, I neglected to mention that tribal authorities are key players there. And that's largely because of a series of court cases known as the Bolt decisions, in which the Lummi Nation pursued aggressively the protection of their salmon resource, their treaty fish. The court determined that they had possessory rights under U.S. property law of half the salmon. And then in a series of downstream cases, U.S. versus Washington 2, the court determined that they also had the right to protect the fish. So now, in terms of timber and fish committees, they're engaged in water regime management in the Pacific Northwest to protect their treaty fish. So the concept of linking treaty rights, free, prior, and informed consent, the duty to consult, to decisions that are made to regulate water are critical. These, every time a decision is made that changes the level of a waterway in Manitoba, they are affecting a treaty right. They are affecting an Indigenous right, and the Constitution protects those rights and therefore limits the ability of the Crown or Hydro to be making those arbitrary or those intentional, they're in essence not arbitrary, they're planned, those types of planned decisions that result in the changes in the water levels. To have that as a concept going into the with government is critical, particularly on relicensing, because there's a whole suite of terms and conditions that would need to be. It's not Hydro's lake, and the waterways to the province, they are held under be absolutely crucial. To come up with a common position on water regime management, present it to government, and ensure that it's pursued. I would also say that the period of time in which co-management was a strong idea has appeared in part in the comprehensive settlement agreements pursuant to the Northern Flood Agreement. Those require land use plans and resource management plans, and the core provisions of that, particularly the model for the Nissachawassa Cree Nation, have been reincorporated by the province in a number of other agreements to aggressively pursue this concept that land, water, and resources are co-planned between First Nations and government, and to present that in every forum. Thank you for my permission to provide this long answer.
Thank you, Michael. Are there any further questions?
Over at the back, on the right.
Over on the end here.
This is to my leadership that are here. You know, you're outright saying like the lakes do not belong to the province. They do not belong to Manitoba Hydro. Why don't we make a bill of some sort where we charge them rent for the use of the water and how much they hold back? Is there a way to do that to compensate our communities?
Thank you. I'll go to Michael.
I think the idea, that's a very important concept to be added to it, to make arrangements. Right now, the province receives water rentals from Manitoba Hydro, which is the largest single resource rent that the province receives from anybody. Mining taxes, I think, still zero. Mining companies are pleading poverty. Resource taxes otherwise are about 40,000, but they receive in excess of $125 million a year from Manitoba Hydro and water rentals. And so there is a concept directly, without losing your idea, for the province to share water rentals with First Nations that are affected, particularly those that are affected by water regime management with Manitoba Hydro. There is a revenue sharing arrangement, a modest one, between government and the Nissachawassa Cree Nation as some of the downstream negotiations on the project development agreement. But that is an important value. It's the largest single resource rent the province receives from anybody and is related to water. In terms of having rental for the use of water or a fee for the modification of water levels, that's a very good idea and it should be pursued because it's First Nations who are having the largest effect on a broad array of rights and interests of considerable value throughout the system. One picture that I would often show with some quick permission here is this one, that if you were looking at the value of fish and game in the MKO region alone, it's valued at conservatively between $35 and $50 million a year. In other words, if you had to replace the game, fish, berries, medicines with cash from some other source, it would be at minimum that kind of a value throughout the north. So that's a very significant value that's not being addressed or compensated in these decisions to manage and manipulate water levels. And so that would also be part of this package of recognizing value is the theme of what you're saying, and then pursuing it through a variety of mechanisms. These values are not being incorporated in the current dialogue and ought to be, including the value of water. I think it's an excellent idea. And to pursue immediately additional sharing of the water rentals being received by the province already from the operators of regulated waterways.
I don't think I have a lot to add to that. I just note that in a couple of hearings, not only First Nations advocated for the sharing of water rental, but also some southern non-government organizations did as well. There was one question from the individual from South Indian Lake who'd asked about privatization. Certainly in terms of when we see good water management practice across North America, sometimes it's with publicly owned companies like Bonneville Power. Sometimes it is with private companies. So I think the more important issue is not whether it's publicly owned or privately owned. Mike may disagree. I think the real issue is whether there's a will to have collaborative water management that gives First Nations their appropriate role.
The one thing I would add to that, and I do have, without getting into the discussion of the difference between a Crown and a private investor-owned utility and how they're regulated, because private utilities are actually subject to more scrutiny by the regulator and therefore more control, but I won't walk down that path right now. The one thing that really is critical that's been in my mind about the privatization concept is the baseline, exactly what we've been talking about. Right now, Manitoba Hydro is pretty much able to operate at will in concert with the agreements that it enters into and so forth, which are generally compensatory. They mitigate and compensate instead of share the decision-making regarding the operation of the waterways. Well, if those license conditions are transferred to any new owner, that's the wrong baseline. So in addition to relicensing the projects, the concept of privatization would necessitate that these long-term operating criteria that Hydro has been operating under for 60-something years are modified to require integrated water resource management, particularly recognizing and taking into account all values and First Nation rights, because that's not the baseline now. And so that's actually a critical concern about any thought about transfer. It's not an asset that goes with the licenses it's already got, because the licenses that that Hydro has now need to be modified. And voices need to be raised to ensure that that takes place.
Thank you, Michael and Byron, for your responses. So with that, I think we will close the question period for that portion. And I wanted to thank again Byron Williams, the Director of Public Interest Law Legal Center of Legal Aid Manitoba, and Michael Anderson, former Director of Manitoba Kootenai-Okmulgee, the Natural Resource Secretariat, for your presentations and your answers and for being with us today. And we have one more item on the agenda. We just need a couple minutes to set up his PowerPoint. So I would like to call up at this time Fisaha Undachi, the Director for the Province of Manitoba's Hydrologic Forecasting and Coordination Branch.
Thanks, Michael.
Yours or Byron's, maybe?
Mine.
I mean, yours?
Legacy.
That's yours.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Fisaha Unduche. I'm basically the flood forecaster, the senior flood forecaster in Manitoba. I've been here in this position for over 5 years now. We just issued our outlook, February outlook, this morning around noon. We had a very busy week. So whatever you see now is basically part of the flood outlook we issued today. Another outlook comes on March. We issue forecast twice, like outlooks twice in a year, in February and March. And occasionally we issue in January when we see like a major flood threat. We issue in January as well. And other than that, I also come to meetings like here, go somewhere else, and so on, to present the flood risk. So I like questions, so you can ask me any question you want, either here or I'll leave my contact or by email or phone. So, what causes flooding? I think most people here know what causes flooding. Just to highlight, high soil moisture at the time of freeze up. Basically, what happens is when rain falls from May to October, most of that rain, what is being stored in the top on top layer of the soil, and it stays there frozen. So until melt comes, and that's about in a normal year, 50% of runoff we see comes from soil from soil moisture. So that's very important. The other factor is winter precipitation. When we get heavy winter precipitation, we know that that snow is going to melt, so that leads to heavy runoff. The other thing is the spring rain. And so what happens is when rain comes, let's say April and May rain, when the rain comes on top of snow melt, when the snow melts, the ground is already saturated, so that rain will lead to another more flood risk. And fast melt rate, when melting happens so fast, when temperature changes significantly so fast, that leads to more flooding. High base flows and levels, what it means is some lakes are already at higher level, so you add more amount of water, then that keeps on adding. So base flows are basically flows and levels in winter. And river ice thickness, when the river ice is thick, that could lead to ice jam related flooding, which is very common in most areas in Manitoba. And the last is frost depths. Like years like this, when temperature is very cold, the frost penetrates deeper in the soil, and what it makes it basically compacts the soil, basically leads to more runoff. So these are on the degree of importance leading to major flooding. And when we look at all the historic floods in Manitoba, they never came by a single factor. Most historic floods always come with a combination of at least 3 or 4 of these ones. So let's start one by one. Soil moisture. So the map you see on the right is the soil moisture this year. So green area shows soil moisture is near normal compared to the last 30 years data. And yellow means the soil moisture is below normal. Blue means the soil moisture is above normal. In an area where it's blue, soil is actually wetter than normal. Green is the soil is as normal as it's supposed to be, and orange is basically dry. So when you look at northern Manitoba, the Saskatchewan River near the area, that is near normal or above normal, and mainly because of the heavy rain we received in June, July, August. When you look at southern Manitoba, Red River Basin is near normal to below normal, and southern Saskatchewan, upper Assiniboia Basin, the Coppell River Basin is below normal. So that's where the soil moisture stands. And the next major factor is winter precipitation. So basically from November 1st up to February 23, that's where we did the data cutoff. So up to from November 1st to February 23, this is what happened. And you could see any area when it's green is between 70 to 90 millimeter. That's about 3 to 4 inches in that range. Anywhere it's yellow is between 50 to 70 millimeter. Anywhere red is below 50 millimeter. So most Manitoba, except the southern portion and except the Souris and the Red River Basin, most Manitoba received 50 to 70 millimeter. Southern Saskatchewan, the Coppell River, the upper Assiniboia Basins received less than 50 millimeter. That area is going through a major drought in the past few years. So the most critical one is the Red River and the Souris River, which received between 90 to 110. When you see, I don't know if you could see my cursor around here, no? So the south portion of the Red River in the United States is between 90 to 110 millimeter. So this is from November 1st up to February 23, precipitation recorded on gauges. We have over 1,200 gauges within this basin that record daily precipitation, and that's where this analysis is. But what happens is, like years like this, you know that the wind moves the snow a lot, and this may not exactly represent what you see in the ground, which I will talk it later. But this is right at the instant of falling, this would have been the exact representation. So this is winter precipitation in a percent normal. So when I talk in millimeters, you may not understand, or it may not make sense because you have to know what happened in the past years. So this is a very good map which shows how the precipitation compares with a normal percentile. So when it's green, it means near normal. When it's a blue, when it's a yellow, it's below normal. Blue is above normal, and the dark blue is well above normal. So the southern basins, the Red River Basin, the Red River and the Souris River basins are above normal to well above normal. So precipitation, when compared to historical observation for this time, is above normal or well above normal. So in normal time, like 2.5 to 3.5 inch of snow water equivalent, for example, and now it's over 4 inch at some areas. So it's normal to above normal. When you move to the central and the northern Manitoba, precipitation record is becoming lower than normal. So yellow area is below normal. So all central Manitoba, northern Manitoba, precipitation has been below normal. The Saskatchewan River, if you look at from Manitoba border all the way up to Alberta, the Saskatchewan River is normal to above normal. So if you recall, the Saskatchewan River had also normal to above normal soil moisture. The winter precipitation is normal to above normal in that basin. So this is the snow water content. So what it means is, like now, we basically send crews to the site and do snow measurement, manual sampling of snow, and we also have a contract with the American National Weather Service to fly a helicopter, a plane, a gamma survey. We call it gamma survey. They run a plane and do the measurement of snow accumulation. So when we combine all this data, this shows what is a snow water equivalent on the ground. So the data I showed you earlier is observed precipitation, but the real precipitation, the real snow amount on the ground is represented by this one. So we are using this one in our model, in our analysis. So when you look at the Red River Basin and the Souris River Basin, it's between 70 to 110 millimeter. That's about roughly between 3 to 4 inch of 3 to 4.5 inch of snow water equivalent on the Red River and the Souris River. And in some areas, it's even more than 110 millimeters. So the blue area, snow water equivalent is more than 110 millimeters. So there was a heavy snow, especially in February. February is one of the wettest years. That area, the southern basins, including southern Manitoba, received heavy precipitation. As you move to the central Manitoba, the snow water equivalent is between 50 to 70 millimeter, and the Saskatchewan River area is between 70 to 90 millimeter. So the green area is 70 to 90. So what we basically see is a heavy snow accumulation